travel back with us to 1985. Eric and I were just wee lads. But Tears for Fears was hitting number 1 with their second album, Songs from the Big Chair. Stay with us.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff. And Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Eric, we were wee lads, weren't we?
We were. Absolutely.
We tiny.
We.
Lilliputians.
1 year out from graduating high school, right? 84?
Well, 85 is when you actually, if you're the class of 84, your graduation exercise is in 85.
Okay. Yes.
So we were when this album came out in February of 1985, we were seniors. I was marking time. Back when we went to high school, you had to have a certain amount of credits. So you needed 21 credits to graduate, and you had to have certain things that you did. I had actually accomplished almost all of them because I was so efficient. I had accomplished most of them by the time I was a senior. So I had pretty much a lot of study halls and a couple of art classes. It was like a hang senior.
Yeah.
For me. Other people were actually studying and making something out of themselves. That was
I'm glad to say that my youngest son is in that position now because he's rocking high school. He's already he's already met all his criteria. Next year is going to be a breeze. He's taking all electives next year, art classes, photography.
He's the man.
So, he's doing real well. So
he's the man. So
share that with everybody.
What brings us to 1985? Well, we're talking about the album from Tears for Fears, Songs from the Big Chair. So we're going to get right into the stats. We're going to hit this one. We're going to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Not a lot of pitter patter for this one.
Nope.
Released in February of 1985, like I said, produced by Chris Hughes, who was the drummer for Adam and the Ants.
Yeah.
Interesting. Didn't know that. 5 singles were released for this album. Shout hit number 1. Everybody Wants to Rule the World hit number 2. Head Over Heels hit number 3. I Believe in Mother's Talk really didn't do anything significant. Even if they were at all released in the US, those might have been UK releases. Yep. It did hit number 1 on the Billboard album chart. So this was, they had a number 1 hit, a number 2 hit, a number 3 hit. It went 5 times platinum. Mm-hmm. And Tears for Fears is a duo musical concern consisting of Roland Orzabal, who was the main lyricist. He's the guitarist, and you got Kurt Smith on bass. Now, they did have, for this album and around this time, they did have a steady band and people that they considered band members. Mm-hmm. But on the face, Tears for Fears was always a duo. Right? Always be positioned as a duo. That gives you the option to throw out people if you don't want them and keep people if you like them, I suppose, right?
I guess they were kind of like the Lennon McCartney / Simon and Garfunkel of the 80s, and, sort of,
I would say maybe probably more. I would say more Simon and Garfunkel.
That's right, because Orzabal was the
main lyricist. Yeah,
he was the genius. He was
right. Good comparison. And not that Chris Smith didn't write stuff; he just didn't write as much. And Roland Orzabal was like the
and he was a multi-instrumentalist, and they both had amazing voices. They just
both very different voices too. Kurt
very
Smith
distinctly
different,
delicate
and higher pitched and a little more tender. And Roland Orzabal was a little more forceful. He's got a very forceful voice.
Yeah, that was the appeal for me. Right out the gate was the vocals and on these songs and such. So, but we'll get to that.
So we're 1985. I remember I bought this cassette. I'm going to tell you though, I don't remember giving it a full listen. I'm going to, straight up like, I bought this, the hits were these hits were earworms, but for some reason, correct me if I'm wrong, I remember Everybody Wants to Rule the World being first. Like, I remember that song first. I don't remember Shout being the first single.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's certainly the hook. That was the song that made me buy.
Yeah, because it was kind of quirky and had an interesting sound.
And the video. The music video. And our good friend John, every time I hear the song, I think of him because that's one of his favorite songs, and he absolutely loved the video because, as you know, he likes to drive everywhere. So it was it was that and the Robert Plant Big Log video
That
where
big
he's in the
log.
car when they're in the car and they're cruising down the highway. And it's like, but he always dug that song, and yeah, it's just it's one of the seminal songs.
Yeah,
of the
I
80s for
remember. I
me.
just remember it being swapped. I remember
Yeah.
Shout coming out and then being a much more serious type song. It was kind of like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
wow. Tears for Fears is kind of like a serious, more.
Yeah, it kind of, you would think that Kurt was the one that was sort of more laid back, and Roland was the serious, like, almost it almost took like, the sound of it almost took like a political stance. It
Yeah.
was more like an anthem type of
Oh,
thing,
yeah,
but
yeah, and as an album and it opens the album too. So
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
yeah. Back in '85, I remember listening to the cassette or maybe jumping around because there were some songs that I absolutely did remember, and then there were some songs I'm like, I don't recall hearing this, and I was happily surprised to when you sent the list and you had this on there. I'm like, oh, songs
yeah.
from the Big Chair. I'm like, yeah, that's had a lot of good songs on it, but now when I'm listening to it now, I'm like, holy crap! Like,
holy shit, right?
there was a lot on there. And before we get there, let's do this because 1985 was a really interesting year for music. You talk about a melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
For us at least, right? I mean, you were knee deep in Phil Collins, and No Jacket Required came out in '85.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And
Suffice
Genesis,
to say,
Peter Gabriel. Yep.
Center Field by John Fogerty came out in 1985, and I was probably listening to that more than anything.
You were. You absolutely were.
When I'm looking at what came out in '85, that and Riptide by Robert Palmer, because that came
I'm
out.
a witness. Yep. In the car all the time. That those were.
I think those two were taking up the most amount of my listening time as far as what new stuff was. Little Creatures by Talking Heads was
another great one. Yeah.
Another great one.
Yep. Yep.
Be Yourself Tonight by the Eurythmics.
Mm-hmm.
Aha, Hunting High and Low with the debut of Take On Me. I had that cassette, but I only ever played that one song. Just played boom, 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 boom. Southern Accents by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. That would hit. That would be the influence of that British invasion. That new British invasion would find its way into there.
Yeah.
Behind the Sun by Eric Clapton.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Welcome to the Real World by Mr. Mister. Eric, we were listening. We had Mr. Mister on our playlist as well.
Yeah, we did.
That album, also, Welcome to the Real World, absolutely.
And also Dire Straits.
Yeah, Brothers in Arms.
Brothers in Arms.
Massive hit
that was a big hit for them. Yep.
Big album for them, big hits. Yep. Promise by Sade, Scarecrow by John Mellencamp. So there was just a lot of eclectic stuff that was going on there. You had that new British invasion, Tears for Fears were a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
You had some American hit, bands. And like I said, Phil Collins was kind of dominating that the radio area of everything. So there was a lot, there was really a lot to choose from. And I think I understand now why you put this on the list. Cause when you sent me the list of things that you were interested in, I was kind of like, what the hell? Like, yeah, that's kind of, it seemed pretty random that you would put it on the list. But then when I listened to this album, I'm like, I understand now.
Yeah.
Except for there's one thing I don't understand why you like this album, and I think it's something
I'm going there right now.
I think you're going to give it a pass. Go ahead.
I'm going to say that, I'm going to recant some of my comments as we did with Gabriel. So you asked me why this, because you hate the polish and the sheen and
there you go. You hit it right. Hang on. I got to give you a bell for that. You predicted exactly. I figured that this album is very glossy and very 80s sounding.
It is. It is.
And I was thinking you're going to give it a pass, right?
But I think what I probably, I'm in that stage where, going back to like analog type of music, especially in the rock. And I think that's probably what I'm referring to. I'm probably referring to how the 80s affected artists that were a little bit older, that were sort of the leftovers from the 70s, trying out all the new toys and the equipment. And it didn't seem to go. And that's I think that's what I mean. I mean, with Tears for Fears, it's a very distinct sound. Yeah. It's a very, they're using this stuff to in a more creative sense. It's it's a genre that I love. I consider it prog. I consider it somewhat prog. There is a term, I guess, looking this up, it was progressive pop. And I could see that. I mean,
Oh yeah.
there's a lot of like little musical interludes and that kind of thing, and sort of, and that's the kind of stuff that I love when based on electronic music. That's when So yes, the '80s did. I'm going to say it. The '80s did have some shining examples of greatness. And this is one of those albums that for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing,
Yeah.
is when I listen to it, I'm like, oh, okay, I see why he really loves this album or really likes it. I was getting it because I was getting the progressive rock. I was getting jazz.
Yeah, jazzy.
The saxophone play. I'm like this. The second song, I'm like, okay, this is totally after you get something anthemic like "Shout," which everybody knows, then to get something totally different. Really different, like with the Working Hour, which is atmospheric, not a lot of lyrics to it, and more of a feel. It makes sense because Tears for Fears, we're trying, like Tears for Fears has always been like a serious band. They've been influenced by what's called the primal scream theory of therapy and kind of letting everything out.
Yes, yeah.
So they're always kind of like a serious thing, and the title songs from The Big Chair that actually came from the movie Sybil from 1976, which deals with someone with multiple personalities. And Sybil felt comfortable when she was in the big chair in the psychiatrist's office.
I never knew that. That was interesting to me when I looked that up. It was.
So then it makes sense that each one of these songs, they're all different.
Yeah.
They all have their own distinct personality. Like, that's the thing with this album that I found enjoyable, is that they're all like, they go from a jazzy solo saxophone type song to, from Shout to this, like the way they just kind of vacillated and really jumped between the genres really well, like instrumental. There's like basically a couple of, instrumental type things on here where it's really, really progressive. The song Broken, like that song Broken is just I'm like listening to it. I'm like, I don't remember ever hearing this. And then you hear the melodic line from Head Over Heels, like kind of tinkling through that song. And then it just kind of goes on its progressive way. I wasn't aware that they were doing this, that they were this versatile. I just thought it was kind of, based in grumpy, grumpy.
No, your experience with this album is exactly the same for me. And it probably wasn't until Seeds of Love that when I heard that record, and I heard, even the song alone, to me, it's like, it's very Beatles. It's like,
of course. Yeah.
They seem to go even bigger, and some of their later work. And that's where I really took notice of Tears for Fears when I came back to this album. Not specifically for this, but you're right. I'm like, yeah, this is work of genius. This is, it holds your interest, and these are the best, and this is what an album should be. It's like, every song should be different. It shouldn't be the same thing over and over again, and that shows the talent. Involved.
Yeah, it was definitely a revelation. This was their second album. Their first album was called The Hurting,
which was very
it did
dark.
Have that minor hit Mad World on it, which has been their version of it actually isn't the most popular version of it. It was covered. I forget who covered it. And it showed up in a video game trailer for the game Gears of War.
Both versions appeared in Donnie Darko.
Yeah,
as well in the film, as Head Over Heels as well. So that when I remember watching that film, that took me back to this record as well. When it gave me chills, and the slow in the high school scene when he's walking out of the school, and you hear the opening to Head Over Heels, and it's like, it's a really iconic that opening. It's a grand piano.
Yeah.
It's not a guitar. It's not it's a piano. Who would have thought that could be just as effective as any guitar riff,
Yeah, it is. It is. It just Head Over Heels is just a great, and that's probably them at their most playful as well. They were able to benefit from MTV. Like you said, the video for Everybody Wants to Rule the World is kind of summery. It's kind of light.
Yeah.
Because that song is kind of a different thing. Also, oddly enough, Roland Orzabal did not want to record this song. It came up at the very end of the recording sessions. He came up with these two chords, and was kind of really prodded on, like, make this a song. And like a week later, they came up and it was Everybody Wants to Rule the World, which was the last track they recorded. And then you've got something like Head Over Heels, which is just a fun video. And it's just kind of a lot of, kind of lighthearted, that
Mhm.
those are the kind of videos I like to see on MTV. I like to see the artists kind of, not always taking themselves so seriously, especially Tears
Right.
for Fears, who I kind of was already aware of at the time was like a series, they were into these deep thoughts and this deep type of thing about psychology and all this kind of stuff.
You would
That could
never,
be that could be off-putting,
well, just the, the look, well, let's face it. I mean, they're very young.
Yeah.
They're very kind of sort of stylish with the hair, and even the album cover, you wouldn't think that this is an album, but you would think that it would have like all this artwork on it and stuff like this, for what it is. Looking at the album, you'd think they're Wham, right?
Yeah,
It's like
true.
you know what I mean. They're kind of like this pop duo, like like boy band type thing, and that's not the case
Yeah,
at
they're
all.
not
I mean,
smiling, but
yeah,
they're not smiling. It's kind of they're kind of serious
they're very
and
sullen, yeah,
yeah, and it's kind of
but
like,
yeah,
oh man, like okay, and like I said, then you have an opener like Shout, and you think, okay, am I going to be preached to
yeah,
this whole album? And it's not like that. And, it's
no,
got they really, um, I don't know. I got so many different vibes from this album. I got like a Sting, Dream of the Blue Turtles came out the same year.
yeah,
I got some of that vibe. I got some of that Sting where Sting was going with things,
hmm
in that time. I got some of that vibe from it as well. In the production, right? You can hear it
hmm
in the, like those electronic grand pianos that they play, or like it's very much of its time, but it like you said, it's done really well, and it really it
yeah,
took me
it
by
is,
surprise. I'll be
and I
honest, I
and
wasn't
I could
ready to enjoy this. Like,
I could totally see, like, I'm convinced, when we, let's get ready for the bell, but Jeff Lynne taking, when I think of Balance of Power, right? That came out, what, 86,
yeah, year
87?
after.
Yeah. Yeah. We were both shocked that there was a saxophone on that record.
Yeah, I was like, what the hell? What the devil?
I'm convinced that Tears for Fears influenced that,
You
or
think so?
I think so. I think, even Peter Gabriel on his third album had a sax player on it. On a couple of songs, and again, very like the heavy brooding drums and the and
Yeah,
all of a sudden the sax comes into play. Like, it's such a weird instrument to, it could be borderline cheesy, it could be, but it's not like, soulful sax. It has an effect. It, like, when used in prog, it gives, I guess, a sense of soul. But like, like Pink Floyd used, Mel Collins is the guy that
yeah,
actually played with them back in the day. He plays on this record, and yeah,
yeah.
it kind of gives that a weird effect. It's like, it's just an odd, odd choice.
One reviewer called it the Baker Street saxophone.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah,
In homage to Jerry Rafferty's
Jerry
song Baker
Rafferty's.
Street.
Yep.
Other reviewers have compared this to Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
not in its form and in its structure, because Dark Side of the Moon, we've done that episode, and you can check it out, is something very different.
Yeah.
But you could see some of the connecting lines of influence. I can absolutely kind of
Mhm.
get some of what that reviewer meant when they kind of called it a descendant of Dark Side of the Moon. This is not a prog album. It's got prog elements to it. It's got jazz elements. It's got rock elements. It's got pop elements. And you would think that'd be a hot mess.
No,
But each song is kind of its own thing. So they're not throwing everything into one song. So every song is not a proggy, jazzy, poppy, rocky thing.
no.
It's each one has it, like I said in the beginning, each one has its own personality.
And they're not singing, about, fairies and
Yeah.
and otherworldly creatures or
Wood,
anything. This,
wood gnomes.
they're talking about real life. They're talking about, real problems and issues, social issues, mental, issues. And to have like this very sort of musically, this very esoteric thing happening is, yeah, I just love it. I love that kind of feel. And they say that, some people argue that there's no soul to prog music, that there's
Mhm.
no, I disagree. I think there's just yes, people could say it's pompous and it's like a sense of, like pretentiousness to it or whatever. And there's, it's not down to earth rock and roll. It's not like,
Mhm.
people can't relate to this, the overall sound of it, because it's, you know, somebody, it's almost like classical music in a way, like, right. They're composing bigger, you know, one thing on
Yes.
top of another type of thing.
Highfalutin ideas.
Right. This long haired, like, you know, stuff, whatever. But it's just, to me, I if it's done right, it could be very emotional.
Yeah. Yeah.
A very emotional experience. Yeah.
And make no mistake, we're not saying that this is a prog album, so we don't want to scare you off that.
No,
What
it's certainly not
is
like a Yes or, you know, or anything like that. But it is, you know,
this is a great album to try out some of those textures.
Right.
Because actually they'll fool you into it. Because I was actually, when I was listening to Broken, it took me about half the song before I realized what the hell was going on. Like, before I realized like what they were pulling. Like after going through each one of the songs, and each one is kind of a different thing. And then one almost, you know, what was it? I think it was, is, oh, you know, there's applause at the end. So you think, well, was this something they recorded live and did it? Or like, what was like, what was going on? And that's some of the theatricality
of it.
Thank you. Why am I going with theatricality? I just made up a new word, like the combination of theater and reality is theatricality.
Coin that shit, man. Coin that phrase.
So you kind of get lulled into it, not realizing what you're experiencing. And then by the time you get to the song Broken, which is in the middle of the second side, well, there's only four, actually, there's only really 4 songs on the second side. So it's the second one. I realized, I'm like, wow, this is kind of jazzy and proggy and with some rock and roll edges to it. But I think there was enough of each to kind of keep you there, you know. And then, like I said, if you're already familiar with the song Head Over Heels, they kind of use that piano melody in there, like it kind of comes in and goes, so they kind of tease you. You know, so if you're listening to this album for the first time, let me put it this way, you'll find some familiarity with that song that'll kind of keep you there, because then it goes right into Head Over Heels. So it's almost like a little mini suite on the second side, where they really got ambitious, you know.
They did, and
which
would carry into their later work, which was even more
which kind of put these 2 songs together.
Yeah.
And then at the end, on the you know, the single Head Over Heels just kind of ends, but on the album, they kind of revisit Broken again. You know, what they were doing in Broken, it kind of closes it out again. So they really were more ambitious than their singles would lead you to believe. I think that's what I took away from this.
And that's the genius.
For someone who had the fucking cassette and apparently didn't listen to it.
This is an absolute, you know, reason why albums exist. You know, why you need to listen to albums instead of just, you know, songs. And just, you know, even now with streaming, I would recommend, you know, this is again another experience to listen to.
Yeah, and it's a quick listen.
It really is. It's only 42 minutes or so. But yes, it's a joy. Yeah.
Like
really
I said,
is.
I'm going to belabor it. It took me by surprise. It really did. I was just kind of like, all right, Tears for Fears. Yeah, I mean, I liked them enough that I bought it.
It's so musically dense that, that's the genius of putting out a single. They did it right. The single hooks you in, right? Everybody wants to rule. Who doesn't love that song?
Yeah,
you know what I mean. I can't think anybody growing up in the '80s who you know, that has got to be on a playlist or a mixtape.
Oh yeah,
or whatever.
It is so of the '80s.
You know, and
actually, it sounds that oddly enough from that album, it sounds the least '80s produced. It has more of a warmer, throwbacky feel because of that guitar in the beginning and you got the nice dense like synth keyboards, but it doesn't have that really overproduced sound. And I think that's maybe why it was a hit, because it's got a nice tasty guitar. Like this album has so many different looks to it that you got fooled. Like they, you know, fool me once, shame on you. But then they put out Head Over Heels, which was another great pop song. And the other stuff in there is like the gold.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like the buried treasure. If you go, you know.
When I look at I look at this and I think of albums like Pet Sounds. I think of Sgt. Pepper because of the melody, the way the songs are constructed. But it's just using the tools of the day at that point, right? I mean, but it's the same type of approach in the songwriting, and that's the kind of prog that I really like. Long instrumental stuff, like that stuff is great for a time, but then you kind of get glossed, glazed over with that. I
Yeah.
prefer stuff like this where it's, and I think that's probably why I'm a big Genesis fan as well, because the old stuff was like that as well. It was more about the songwriting and the melody aspect, the melodic aspects of it, rather than just these virtuosic musicians kind of playing over one another, which a lot of the prog bands of old did that.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said of that, but it's just but this stuff is better. I mean, it's just this kind of, it's more, you appreciate the work and the composition of the thing and the way it's constructed. So
yeah, especially you have to give pretty much props to Roland Orzabal for that. Like I said, even though it's a duo, he was pretty much the driving force. And then oddly enough, the keyboardist in the unofficial keyboardist Ian Stanley kind of contributed as well, and he kind of got the ball rolling with them early on and said, hey, I don't know much about Ian Stanley, but apparently he had an 8-track recorder and he had a studio of his own. He's like, you guys can kind of come over and kind of work on stuff. So there was, even though it's a duo, there was that collaborative spirit, because Ian Stanley did co-write a decent amount of these songs. Well, no, only like 1, 2, 3, 4. The whole first side he co-wrote, or had some of a writing credit on. So and then one on side 2. So he was kind of figured into helping shape that sound. Even though, again, not a quote unquote official member, but as a collaborator, he's right in the thick of it, helping out. But Roland Orzabal will always be that way, because what happened is after Seeds of Love came out, the album you were just referencing, which was their follow-up, which was very trippy and
very
Beatlesque. The Seeds of Love was very Beatlesque, which I was into at the time, but it didn't leave a lasting impression on me. Tears for Fears would break up really acrimoniously, not get along, and Roland Orzabal would continue Tears for Fears as his project. Like, so he basically took it over, and Tears for Fears just became like his, he was Tears for Fears. And kind of soldiered on through the years. And then in I don't know, early 2000s, there was some paperwork that needed to be signed by Kurt Smith. And they ended up kind of going out and going to dinner and kind of mended fences and said, they kind of patched it up, which you like to hear about. We've bemoaned it high and low about the acrimony you can have, but these guys actually patched things up and just put out an album last year or the year before.
It's
good. The Tipping Point,
it's a very good album, by the way. I might add, it still retains that what they were doing. It's a little bit more modern, and as far as the equipment involved, but I think it's still very much of its of that sound. And I was very surprised by that record when I heard it.
Yeah, that was happy to hear from them again.
And that was the reason why I put it on the list, was because because of Tears for Fears. Really, let's see what they're up to these days. And I was like, they're still good, So I was like, hey, let's do the biggest hit. Why not? Let's throw that on there.
Yeah, no, it was a great choice, and it's great to see a band. We were talking in our Decades episode about there are no legacy bands from the 80s or from the 90s really, and it's nice to see that these aside from going on like the nostalgia tours, but it's nice to see that they pulled it together and people were excited to hear from them again. People were excited about the Tipping Point coming out and what was it going to be, because their last album was like 2003 or I don't even know what it was. So there was a really long hiatus. They were touring and doing whatever they were doing. But as far as recording, which we always look forward to, we talk about that a lot. Like these bands are out there touring, but they're not recording anything. And you want to, like you said, it made you curious enough to say, oh, wow, what the hell, has it changed? What's going on with them, and to check them out again.
And typically, like sometimes most, I don't know if I could say most of the time, but if there is something new, chances are it's not that good. They kind of lost their touch or whatever. But in this case, I wouldn't say that it's as good as that stuff. back in the day, but it's good enough to really appreciate what they are and what they're capable of. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
and
it's
they're
just,
committed to it. That's the thing is they
it's just
wouldn't
the
have done it.
artistry of it. It's not,
Yeah,
they're
they
not
wouldn't have
just
done it if they weren't invested in it. Like,
it's not a fly by night band. They're not out there, touring just to tour.
yeah,
They may
exactly.
have to, to make money, whatever, but they're still in the game as far as like, putting some thoughts down. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
They know
yeah,
what they're
which
doing.
makes it
So
genuine, and that's the difference
yeah,
between bands reforming because a company lured a big payday in front of, like, get back together and we'll do this. Like, that's
right.
different than them getting back together organically and saying, let's kind of go into the studio, let's see what happens, let's see if we can kind of,
Yeah.
is the spark still there, or is it there but it's different, and that's what I enjoy, and that's what yeah, the nostalgia tours are great, but if you grew up and they're your favorite artists, you still, maybe not everybody wants to hear new music from them, but the fans do. The fans do. That's why they're
Oh,
the
well,
fans.
certainly. Yeah.
They're happy seeing them live and all that stuff. But like I said, came up with Billy Joel. Like why doesn't this guy? How could this guy not have anything to say?
I know.
How could this guy not have
I know.
melodies floating around in his head? He was so prolific, right? And all of a sudden he's
Mhm.
just like, oh no, I don't have anything. It's like, I think it's because they fear like that people just don't give a shit. Dennis DeYoung says it all the time. He's like, yeah, people don't want to hear that. They want to hear Come Sail
Yeah.
Away, which he's right about. But I don't know. I don't know if as a musician you just kind of give up like that.
To give up like that because you're not really doing it for yourself anymore, right? You're doing it for the
Yeah.
fans, and it's like that. You're letting them dictate to you,
Yeah,
saying,
exactly.
calling you. You know what you want to say, and you might have so many things to say, but
Yeah.
but you're so whatever. But
And this era, it's
it's a shame.
easier to digitally. You could just distribute the stuff yourself. You don't even need a record label anymore. You could
Yeah,
just put it up. You could just record it and put it on iTunes. So it's actually easier now for
hmm
those artists that don't feel there's an audience or people want to hear it. They can still do the things they want to do,
yeah,
and be vital. Still do your nostalgia tours, but still put out stuff if you want to. So I think now is back then it was probably harder. Like a label, yeah, we don't want to distribute. You're not going to sell anything, so it's not worth our time.
hmm
Nowadays you can self distribute, and it's a non-issue. So I'm still puzzled by that in some in some ways, because there's plenty of artists that are out there that are cranking out crappy music, but they're still doing it, right? They're
yeah.
it's not great stuff, but they're
No,
still out
it's
doing it.
not.
But then the artists that are really are really revered, kind of like are like, well, no, people
Well,
people don't want to hear from me, and it's like I
life
think you're wrong.
experiences too. I think has an effect.
Hmm.
You think of bands like Rush, who did some of their best work in their later years because they kind of reinvented themselves and they came
Yeah,
back to the sort of rock thing. The 80s was just so much keyboards and they just kind of ditched that and they came back to form and they one solid album after another. It's just
yeah.
real
They weren't
consistent.
number ones. They weren't just running off the
No,
shelves,
but it
but they
was
were doing
good
stuff that they
stuff
liked.
though. It
Yeah,
was just really good, consistently good
they felt confident with
quality
it. Yeah,
quality work, and that's what
absolutely.
you want from a band. Because we're all older. I mean, as fans too, you grow old, and it's not like you're out there going to a concert, hey, you're half drunk and you don't really care what they're doing on
Well,
stage. It's like,
maybe speak for yourself.
I no, for personally, no, it's not my experience, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you tend to change too. And sometimes all you want to hear is just good music. And that's what makes you feel good is that somebody of who's older than you or,
Yeah.
can still deliver.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. Maybe a younger audience won't take the leap of faith, but I think all of the art. If you like somebody from the '80s and they come out with a
mhm,
new album, I think those fans will still kind of try it out. Yeah, it's not going to
yeah,
sell the way it does. Nothing does.
yeah,
Nothing sells the way it used to. The music industry is different, so it's kind of like, yeah, just put it out. If you want to do it, put it out. That's our message to every artist that's not listening to this podcast, that will never hear us plead with them. But getting back to this album.
hmm
Ah, man. Um, yeah, it is the one thing I did write down is that it was a victim of the '80s, right?
yeah,
Um, but I think you kind of made a really great point in saying that, and I think you tied it up. I think you kind of made the point for me as well. is what our problem was with it was artists that were not from that decade
Mm-hmm.
trying to put it on there, and then it sounded like they were trying to imitate the younger folk.
Yeah, because don't
Whereas
forget,
those artists like Eurythmics and The Cure and all
and we
those
weren't.
bands of that era were
I
that was their tools.
I was not appreciating that stuff
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
I was, because I was still, my head was, we were just getting into a lot of those bands, weren't we? Like Zeppelin and, and we wanted to hear new music by the people we loved.
And it didn't sound right.
And to me, the rock, it affected rock as a whole. I never liked the sound of, this I'll maintain. I'll hold my
take coming in.
But like a lot of the rock bands of the 80s too, I never liked the way they sounded. I didn't like the polish. To me, rock and roll should be raw. It should be, loud, analog, kind of thing. And, that sheen, a lot of that stuff for me, it didn't fit. It didn't quite.
You know what? I associate it more with jazz. And I think that's why on when the working hour, the second track, when that starts, and it starts off with a solo saxophone,
mm-hmm.
and then like this plinking of it almost has like an Asian feel to it. It's like, like a plink. I don't know if it's a harp or what they're plinking. That production style kind of puts me in the back in the 80s into the like there was that really smooth jazz that had that style to it.
Mm-hmm.
It had that really clean production style to it, and that kind of, hearing it on this album kind of put me into that mode of, okay, yeah, I'm not going to put this in the rock basket sonically. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
This wasn't produced like a rock record. It was produced like something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but if you're being a snob like we are, which I don't think people are, people are just going to listen to it like, yeah, it sounds like a record. Like, what the fuck is your problem? Right? Because we bemoan this endlessly, but I think but maybe people start to listen and be like, oh yeah, I kind of hear that echoey stuff that they're talking about. I think this approach works for this because of so many different types of music that's on the album, that I don't think the best one size fits all would be to go with what the production technique of the time was.
I agree. And
I think if you tried to mess with, oh, we're going to have this feel
mm-hmm.
and produce it a different way, then I think you're getting into dangerous territory with this album. I think that the consistency is the production of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only thing that's consistent is kind of the production. The songs are all different, which is a great cornucopia, like I said, of just different things.
And you're able to, texturally, it all comes down to noise, really. What the types of noises that you were able to achieve with the tools of the day. When you're using it to that effect, when you're creating sounds, you're not just emulating a guitar, or that's where that's the stuff I don't like, is when a drum comes in. You want that crisp, crack of a snare. You want that heavy, drum sound.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to hear, like this weird sort of like it. It's interesting. I could see drum machines over electronic drums.
Yeah,
because at least with drum machines, it sounds somewhat. It's electronic. It's mechanical.
Yeah, you're sampling the actual. Well, you're kind of trying to create.
So you're creating a rhythm, and it's just it has a different texture, a different sound. With a drum, like you get behind a drum kit, you don't want to hear, like
endless echo of it.
You want to hear, you want to hear the whole spectrum of each drum. That's why drums are made. That's what they're made for. So, but it's like I never understood like Simmons drums and things like that, like pads and it always had that artificial sound, and when rock drummers were using those things,
they thought it was refreshing though at the time. This doesn't sound like my drum kit, right? It sounds futuristic. And speaking of like sampling and stuff like that, on the song Mother's Talk, which closes out side one, there's some strings in there. Those were sampled from a Barry Manilow record.
Yeah.
So they were using the tools of the time. I don't know if they used a Fairlight on this album. I don't think they used a Fairlight computer. But there was drum programming and synths on here, so they probably got a
Mm-hmm.
sample of it and played it through a synthesizer. So
Mm-hmm.
again, using the tools of the time with people that were excited to use it, right? Not because they had to, like, oh, we need to be relevant in the 80s
Mm-hmm.
because we're a band from the 70s, so we need to try and figure out how we're going to shoehorn in. Tears for Fears was squarely, their first album. They were formed in 1981, so they are squarely of the 80s. So this was like
That's right.
this was
Yeah.
the stuff that they used and the stuff they grew up on, which does make a difference. Now,
I would argue, I mean, they would say that they're probably influenced by people like Brian and Lennon and McCartney. But I would think also they're probably heavily influenced by people like Brian Eno.
yeah,
And who
absolutely.
was
Floyd, like I said, Floyd
like
and
the
10cc.
synth masters of the
Yeah.
time, of even in the 70s, they were people like that who were experimenting already with this electronic sound that that carried over. But
even parallels to 10cc have been drawn to.
Well, that there is a
well.
direct comparison. Somebody said that this album was the original soundtrack, of 10cc's original soundtrack album with "I'm Not in Love." That this album was a reflection of that, like it was like that they might have influenced them with that. So I get it. Gary Wright's Dreamweavers as well. That whole album is nothing but synthesizer, keyboard,
and it's interesting. I don't know that we've we talk about 80s artists in their own bubble. Like we've always kind of separated them out as something different, right?
Yeah.
I think this might be the first band that we've talked about from the 80s that we are acknowledging that their influences came from the 70s, even though they don't sound like the 70s, right? They're not sounding like Pink Floyd, and they're not sounding like 10cc.
No,
but the influence is there. And I think that's the first, we've done quite a few 80s albums. Mm-hmm. I think this is the first artist that we've done that has that connection. Because like I said, we've always kind of put the 80s artists or episodes always in their own bubble.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. Like, oh, this is of the 80s and, this is an 80s album. And this most decidedly is. But these guys are kind of reaching back a little bit.
I think so.
And adapting then adapting it. Right. And make using their technology, their influences to make something new. Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to get this on vinyl. I think I really want to listen to this on vinyl.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably sounds amazing.
I know I bought the cassette when it came out. Obviously,
that's the only thing I ever had. I didn't even have.
I don't think I had the CD.
No.
And then I listened to it obviously on streaming now, but just the way it's just from the sequencing of the album too. When I listened to it on Spotify, I'm like, oh wow, it was over already because it was kind of deceptively short. I think on vinyl. I think if you sit down and you have to give it that attention, I think there's even more there.
Probably.
Because this was a very, like I said, this was a very revealing listen for me. Much like Peter Gabriel's So. Yeah, like I told you at that time, I hadn't really, I knew the hits, but kind of kept them at arm's length. Mm-hmm. I didn't keep this at arm's length because I had it, but I just don't ever recall giving it the time of day. Like I said, there was other things that were more pressing, like the return of John Fogerty. Like for me, if when I was looking at that list, I'm like, that's I think in '85, that's all I cared about was center field, was his return, to the fold. So I can absolutely admit being distracted by things that were closer to what I would normally listen to. Mm-hmm. And kind of having this as one of the many cassettes in my car, but it quickly kind of getting pushed to the side as soon as like Riptide came out by Robert Palmer, because he was hot off of Power Station and we were both digging that kind of thing that was going on with him, kind of the crooner, that thing that he was into, so I can absolutely see this getting lost in the shuffle. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if I'm happy that happened, but I think I am happy that happened.
I am too.
I think this wouldn't have aged as well for me.
Doing this podcast actually and talking about some of the albums that we have really put me back. I've been listening to nothing but, albums like this, like the prog thing again, and revisiting a lot of this stuff that, some of it that I didn't even listen to back there, albums that I never heard by artists that I love. And so I'm like visiting that stuff. And I'm kind
Yeah.
of like, it's like, wow, I told you I was also listening to a lot of Bowie and the changes in his field, like all the different stages of and all the different types of music that he was into. And it's fascinating. And I was like, what the fuck have I been? But I start thinking that, but I don't regret it though, because I just don't think that, we really gave a shit as much. I mean, we loved music, but we loved
what we
I don't know.
loved,
We
right? And
loved
it
what
was
we loved. We were very specific. Yes. And we were just,
and I think everything else was fighting, and it might be that way for everybody else too. Like you have your artist, and then everything else is kind of fighting to get in. So if something quirky, if there was something, especially for me, if it was something really quirky, I would kind of pick up on it. But then again, I would pick up on that one thing and just enjoy that one thing, and then get back to my main diet, my main sustenance of the music I would listen to. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And I think Tears for Fear, had Centerfield not come out, or some of those other albums, maybe, because I don't, Southern Accents came out. I wasn't into Petty that much then. I didn't listen. I didn't have Southern Accents. I knew this, Don't Come Around Here No More, and Rebel Rebel, and whatever. Not Rebel
Which
Rebel,
I loved.
but Rebels. That was
which
Bowie,
I loved.
But
don't
I
come
certainly
around here no more.
Yeah. But I certainly wasn't into Petty at that point, but because it was other things. So
yeah,
it's strange the way it works. I think I'm going to say I'm glad that I'm glad I gave it the listen now, because I think I'm more prepared and better, more mature to enjoy this, as opposed to pass it off as, oh, this was like an interesting album back then. I really enjoyed listening to it now.
Yeah,
I'm in my headspace now.
A much deeper appreciation, and it I don't know. You're not so limited anymore. You're not so like there's like boundaries. You're so because we were. I mean, like
usually get worse when you're old. Usually that happens when you're older. You get less tolerant of stuff, right?
Well, not really, because we were so concerned about liking certain. I don't know about you, but I'm speaking for myself here. I mean, I liking certain bands meant that you had a whole uphold some a image of some sort, right? You
had to be loyal.
You had to be loyal. You had to be, and you had to know how to defend what you love too, right? Yeah. People were always putting you down. What are you listening to that shit for? Like, oh, there was always somebody, and at least for me, that was right there to say, what do you? That sucks, or and it's like so I would retreat. A lot of this stuff I had to listen to in secret, almost. It's like it's almost like coming out of the closet, as it were. Like it just, you kind of felt like am I the only one that appreciates this kind of thing? So to me, it's a revelation today to see so many people embrace this kind of music, even like stuff like people seem to be more accepting of everything across the board, and not just it's not so compartmental. I'm going to tongue tie on this one.
Compartmentalized. I got that one.
Be so compartmentalized in that sense.
Now we're even.
Like so.
Safe to say, we do favorite tracks. There's only 8 to choose from. Should we bother? Just listen to the whole fucking thing.
I agree. Right? It demands that, and as you pointed out, every song is different. So it's definitely an experience. And an enjoyable
I think that's the best way to go with this one. Usually we give you some pointers and some things to kind of check out if you're not sure. Go with this one. Go with this one. Like I said, I can't believe how surprised I was listening to it. And like you said, I think that's one of the great things about doing this podcast is revisiting old stuff and maybe getting something new, but then revisiting something that I had but never listened to. And I'm, like I said, guilty as charged on multiple counts for that.
It's not just a sense of nostalgia, is it? I mean, there is a healthy dose of that, I think, in what we talk about. It's going in.
I think that's what I was going to have. I'm going into this one. I'm like, okay, we're diving back in, but yeah, they took me by surprise.
We're actually reevaluating, re-experiencing things that we just frankly just didn't appreciate, or just didn't have. We appreciate it for different reasons.
We appreciated it for the sheer joy of listening to music. of
Yeah.
something that was catchy or something that was quirky that,
Right.
that caught our eye or our ear, as it were. In doing this podcast, we're challenging ourselves to kind of either relook. I always challenge myself to relook at things, not from like the home, like when we do ELO, I challenge myself not to look at it from a Homer standpoint, but kind of what am I getting something new out of this, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's been the fun part of this journey is when we do it for films, and I, I kind of don't just listen to the album and say, oh, I got to fucking listen to this. You know, it's kind of like I kind of go into it saying, okay, what am I going to, since I'm going to
Yeah.
devote the time to this, what am I going to get? Am I going to get something new out of this? And maybe I don't, and that's okay too if you don't, right? Sometimes what
That's right. Yeah.
what you go with is what you've got.
Mhm.
But I'm
And maybe
happy,
that's all
and
you
then
need
sometimes you get
for that
pleasantly
particular.
surprised. Yeah.
Maybe that's all that's required for that particular piece, that album that just, you just know it's good. And, it's like an old sweater or some,
Yeah.
a pair of comfortable shoes that, that are just still hanging around that you just love, that you'll never stop loving.
Yeah.
For that very reason, but it doesn't give you anything more when you revisit it,
Yeah.
but
I
something
think
like this, I feel
to continue your analogy, this for me was an old coat that was never worn. So it still had the tags on it, and I bought it back then and never put it on. And you go back into the closet and it's there. That's exactly what this album was. It's something that was purchased back then and never really, which we're all guilty of, buying clothes and then putting it in the closet, and then it's like, oh shit. When did I buy that? When did I buy that shirt? It looks familiar, but I don't remember because you never wore it. You never got around to wearing it because I think that's what this album was for me.
Sure.
So, I think we've advocated enough for that. So you can absolutely get it on the streaming services, Spotify and Apple Music, as it is. It's not called iTunes anymore. It's Apple Music. So while you're there, why don't you give us a follow? This way you get all of the latest episodes when they drop. You get a little notification on your app that we're ready and waiting for you. And then you can listen to those at your leisure when you feel like it. But new episodes do drop every Thursday. Also, check us out on YouTube as well. We've got a great channel. You can see the video versions of these. Some drop same day. Some we hold back a little bit and put them out later. But we've always got new content up there for you to check out. So by all means, give us a like and a subscribe, which would be very cool, right? Any closing thoughts?
No, just take a listen to this. If you haven't listened, and revisit it, see and see if you agree.
Huh.
Let us know. Comment on it. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
See if you agree with our assessment. If you disagree, that's fine too. We'd like to hear it. But I think you'll find that you may find something different in listening to this again. I think. Yep.
Don't take them for granted like I did. Go check it out. So that's going to do it for this episode of the 3324 podcast. For Eric, this has been Dean, and we'll most certainly see you on the flip side.
You've been listening to the 3324 podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 podcast and on Twitter at 3324p to join the conversation.